At 0830 hours on August 13, 2025, the guided missile destroyer USS Higgins approached the Scarborough Shoal at a steady 15 knots. The patrol was not unusual. For decades, U.S. destroyers had conducted freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. But this patrol was the first within the shoal's contested waters in more than 6 years, and both Washington and Beijing knew the encounter would not be routine. At 0833, radar operators aboard Higgins reported multiple surface tracks inside the shoal. Dozens of contacts appeared: fishing vessels, Coast Guard cutters, and the ever-present militia trawlers that formed the first layer of China's maritime shield. Among the clutter, however, a distinct contact closed fast from the north. At 0836, classification was confirmed: a PLA Navy Type 054A frigate, hull number 573, identified as the Liu Zhu. The frigate was making 27 knots, heading directly toward the destroyer. The intercept angle was deliberate, aggressive. At 0838, a sharp voice cracked across the radio. U.S. warship, you are entering Chinese territorial waters. Alter course immediately.
U.S. Navy warship 76. This is Chinese Navy warship 573. You have illegally entered the territorial waters of Huangyan Island of the People's Republic of China without the permission or approval of the government of People's Republic of China. Your behavior has posed threat to the safety of Huangyan Island. Alter course and leave immediately.
On the Higgins Bridge, the officer of the deck answered in calm, flat English. This is United States warship, conducting lawful operations in accordance with international law. We will continue on our planned course. It was a script delivered dozens of times before, but the Liu Zhu wasn't here to listen. At 0842, the frigate executed its first blocking maneuver, cutting across Higgins' bow at 2,000 yards. Spray flew off the frigate's hull as sailors lined the decks with cameras. On the American bridge, the captain ordered no deviation. The destroyer held steady. The crew felt the tension in every vibration of the hull. At 0845, radar picked up a second Chinese combatant. A Type 052D destroyer, hull number 161, the Hohhot, entered the battlespace from the east, making 30 knots. The trap was forming. At 0848, the first low pass came from the air. Two J-16 fighters swept overhead at 2,000 feet, afterburners roaring. The destroyer's SPY-1D radar tracked them seamlessly, while VLS cells stood armed with SM-2s. CIC reported full fire solutions if required, but the order remained firm: maintain course, hold fire. At 0852, the Chinese frigate closed again, this time within 1,000 yards. Binoculars on the American deck picked out sailors waving flags and shouting through loud hailers. The intention was clear: force the destroyer to react. At 0854, the Higgins answered with steel instead of words. The 5-inch gun mount rotated smoothly, barrel tracking across the frigate's deck. For a tense 10 seconds, the Liu Zhu had an American naval gun pointed squarely at its bridge. The frigate altered course slightly, giving the destroyer just enough space to continue forward. For the first time that morning, the Americans had the upper hand. At 0858, the wider picture shifted again. Multiple Coast Guard cutters entered the shoal from the west, and smaller maritime militia trawlers surged ahead to document every angle. The South China Sea was becoming a theater stage. At 0903, the radar operators reported new activity to the south. A Philippine Coast Guard vessel, the BRP Teresa Magbanua, had entered the shoal on a resupply run. The Philippine captain requested voice comms with the Higgins, reporting aggressive Chinese maneuvering from earlier in the week that had led to a collision between two Chinese cutters. The message was clear: the Philippines had been harassed, and they welcomed the American destroyer's presence. At 0906, The Chinese response to the Philippine vessel was immediate. 2 Coast Guard cutters accelerated to cut off its course, using the same aggressive blocking maneuvers being used against Higgins. At 0909, one cutter swerved too hard, colliding with the bow of the other. Spray erupted as metal ground against metal. Higgins' crew watched the collision unfold on radar and through long-range optics. The Philippines Coast Guard reported the incident live, calling it reckless and dangerous. The collision embarrassed Beijing, but also escalated its determination. The PLA Navy would not allow both the Philippines and the United States to sail freely inside the shoal. At 0913, sonar operators aboard Higgins reported a new contact, probable type 039A Yuan-class submarine, range 12,500 yards. The acoustic signature matched earlier recordings. It was creeping closer, silent but certain. At 0916, the Chinese destroyer Ho-Hot lit up Higgins with fire control radar. The electromagnetic beam was unambiguous. The destroyer was locked. Inside CIC, alarms blared. Fire control quality tracking, bearing 095, the report came. The TAO requested authorization to counter-illuminate. The captain declined. Professional discipline held. At 0919, the Americans attempted to push through. Higgins accelerated to 28 knots, engines straining as it surged between the Liuzhou and the shoal. The maneuver nearly succeeded. For a moment, the American destroyer had the angle, threatening to break the blockade. At 0922, the frigate Liuzhou faltered, unable to block in time. Higgins's radar locked its hull with precision fire control. For the first time that morning, it was the Chinese ship that looked vulnerable. CIC reported, "Target locked, firing solution complete." For 30 tense seconds, the U.S. destroyer held dominance. But dominance is fleeting when outnumbered. At 0925, 2 additional Coast Guard cutters surged from the west, boxing Higgins into a narrowing lane. At 0927, the UN submarine raised its periscope just 6 nautical miles away, visible even to naked eyes. The message was unmistakable. Any shot fired by Higgins would result in instant retaliation from surface, air, and below. At 0930, the situation turned. The Philippine vessel, still shadowed by Chinese cutters, transmitted distress calls reporting it was being blocked entirely from its mission. The Higgins was boxed in too tightly to intervene. For the Americans, the humiliation was clear. They could not protect an ally in real time. At 0934, 7th Fleet relayed orders via satellite. Disengage. Document. Do not escalate. The mission had already made its point, but escalation could not be risked. At 0936, Higgins' captain gave the order. Come to course 145, ahead full. Withdraw. The destroyer turned southeast, leaving Scarborough Shoal behind. The Chinese forces didn't let the exit go quietly. At 0940, the Liuzhou surged across Higgins' stern at close range, spray battering its wake. At 0943, J-16 fighters dived again, this time locking their targeting pods directly onto the destroyer's bridge. At 0946, the submarine released a single mocking sonar ping that rattled across Higgins' hull. The Americans understood the meaning. Boxed, surrounded, outmatched. By 0952, Higgins cleared the immediate shoal. By 0958, Chinese vessels and aircraft reduced pursuit, their point proven. At 10:05, Chinese state media was already broadcasting footage. Clips of Higgins turning south, framed as driven out. Videos of the Philippine cutter being blocked, framed as defending sovereignty. And official statements declaring Scarborough secure. At 10:15, the U.S. Navy issued its statement. Higgins had conducted lawful operations and asserted navigational freedoms. Technically true, but to the watching world, the video told another story. an American destroyer boxed in and forced to leave under pressure. By 10:30, the Philippine Coast Guard released its own account, condemning Chinese blocking maneuvers and welcoming American support, but acknowledging neither Manila nor Washington had broken the blockade that morning. For Beijing, the propaganda victory was sealed. For Washington, the bitter truth was unavoidable. The Higgins had shown power in the middle, threatened to dominate, but ended surrounded and ordered to withdraw. At 1100, the sailors of Higgins rotated off watch, exhausted but professional. They had stood ready to fight. They had held their line, and for a fleeting moment, they had been the hunters. But by the end, the destroyer left Scarborough not in triumph, but in retreat. The lesson was unmistakable. Scarborough Shoal was no longer a symbolic reef. It had become the front line of naval brinkmanship, a place where both allies and adversaries tested resolve. On August 13, 2025, the balance had tilted. The U.S. Navy remained powerful, dangerous, and respected. But inside the shoal, surrounded by coordinated Chinese surface ships, fighters, and submarines, power alone was not enough. The Philippines had learned the limits of American protection. The Americans had learned the cost of operating boxed in. And Beijing had learned that, at least for one morning, it could not only challenge, but also force the world's most dominant navy to yield.